Hey, my name is Jesselyn, and I'm the Executive Director of KIN. It's very good to be back here this morning with all of you. The last time I came here was 2 years ago, as Rev Glenn said, when Reverend Liao Wenbin was preaching over here. But also, fun fact, I know this neighborhood really well, like the back of my hand. What was that? Yeah, because I grew up over here. I grew up in this neighborhood. I lived down the road, I don't know which direction, down the road at 800 something, and I've played at the playgrounds there, and I grew up at the church opposite as well. So I even took my wedding shots at the playground, the watermelon and the mangosteen playground. So yeah, so I have very fond memories of this area. So thank you, Reverend Glenn, for giving me this privilege of worshiping with all of you here this morning. And I hear that over this past month, as part of your Good News for All Family Life sermon series, you have talked about young people, families, seniors, and singles. And indeed, the family that God has called us to build relationships with is not confined to those who are in your home, but extends into this church and into the community as well. So, and I'm here today because it is your vicar's prayer that you as a church will take another step forward in including a group of people who are definitely among us but may not always be seen. And these are the people with special needs. My message today is titled, Are We a Burden or Blessing? So let me start by turning on the clicker. And let me start by sharing a fact with you. I'll need help to switch to the next slide. Thank you. Do you know that globally, 1 in 6 people live with significant disabilities? And that is equivalent to 1.3 billion people in the world, which is roughly the population of China. This makes people with disabilities the largest minority group in the world. And they remain one of the most overlooked groups in Christian missions today. Many people with disabilities have never heard the gospel or experienced meaningful participation in the life of the church. And in Singapore, about 3% of the population lives with a disability. That translates to roughly 180,000 people, or enough to fill the National Stadium 3 times over. Yet a survey that we conducted a few years ago found that 90% of Christians with disabilities are not attending church today, often because they do not receive the support that they need, and churches may not know how to support them effectively. And this is the reason why KIN exists, to enable churches to welcome and disciple people of all abilities better. I've been clicking the wrong way. This is the reason why KIN exists. We exist to enable the church to welcome and disciple people of all abilities better, that we may all become disciples and disciple makers of the world. Because the reality is that for many of these people and families with special needs, the Great Commission looks more like the Great Omission. The Great Commission looks more like the Great Omission. They are not seen, not heard, and left out of church. And perhaps the Great Commission is a good place for us to start our sermon today. Let's look at Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 to 20, where Jesus gives the Great Commission here. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. When Jesus said, make disciples of all nations, the word translated as nations is the Greek word ethne. And when we hear this verse, a world map probably comes to mind. We picture sending missionaries overseas, we picture supporting a church plant in Cambodia or doing a medical mission in India. But actually the concept of nations, of countries with borders and flags, did not exist in Jesus' day. Ethne actually instead refers to people groups, communities bound together by kinship, culture, and shared traditions. The gospel was never meant to be something that we only pursue at a distance. The Great Commission calls us to reach every people group, not just the unreached tribe in a remote village, but the overlooked community right here in our own church and our community. And one of the most overlooked people groups are people with special needs. They may be present, but do they truly belong? And this matters because the kind of church we are says something about the kind of God that we worship. People are watching, and how we treat one another will always speak louder than the programs that we run, the size of our buildings, or the quality of our events. We are witnesses, whether we realize it or not. Let me tell you a little bit of story about this. So before joining Kin, I spent a decade working as a psychologist in the social service sector, mainly with adults with moderate to severe intellectual disabilities. And one young adult that I worked closely with had severe autism, and he faced many challenges. So I met his parents often because they faced many challenges in their daily lives. And during one of these meetings, his father, who was not a Christian, he shared with me something with tears in his eyes. He told me how he had asked his wife's church to baptize their son. But the church said no, because it was their protocol that the person must be able to speak, to confess their faith, but the son could not do so because he couldn't speak. Then the father said something I'll never forget. He said, "I'm not a Christian. I just want my son to belong somewhere after my wife and I are no longer around. But even God doesn't want him." Even God doesn't want him. Not you all or the church doesn't want him, but God. The church's response made God's love seem too small for their son. Like it or not, as Christians, we carry the name of Christ in all our words and our deeds. As his witnesses, people are always watching to see whether our lives reflect what we proclaim about our God, whether he is as special as we say that he is. And this family that I've just told you about, they were never explicitly rejected from church. They were never told that they couldn't enter the church or join in its activities. But that day, the message that they received was that God's love had limits. They learned that the church could not accept people who couldn't speak. Stories like this should challenge us to examine how the church, often unintentionally, can play a part in disabling people. Like this comic that you see over here, the church may have a facade of being welcoming, but in reality, there could be many barriers for people with disabilities to enter. And often these barriers are not only physical, they could also be our protocols and our practices. I'm not saying that these things are bad on its own, that we shouldn't have protocols and that we shouldn't have certain ways of doing things. What I'm saying is that the reason that we have all these things is to guide us in our decision-making as a group, in our life as a church, to encourage us to come together as one people, as in harmony, to live in harmony with one another. But when we lose track of why we have these things, then like the story that I just told you, we would run into trouble. Because rules are meant to serve people by protecting and guiding them, not to be more important than people. So through today's passage in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 to 6, I hope to help us to reflect on whether and how our expectations may have kept us from truly including people with special needs in our church family. So in this passage that we're looking at today, Jesus is invited to a Sabbath meal at the home of a well-known Pharisee. But the context tells us that this was no friendly gathering at all. Because back in Luke chapter 6, verse 11, after Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, we are told that the religious leaders were filled with fury, and they began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. To them, the Sabbath was a holy day on which no work should be done, not even an act of healing. And so from that point on, their opposition towards Jesus only grew. Luke chapter 14 is the third time that Jesus was invited to a meal with the Pharisees. and it would be the fourth time that he would be accused of Sabbath breaking. So by this point, it is clear that these meals were not about showing hospitality to Jesus. They were hostile, watching him closely, looking for a reason to accuse him. And at this particular meal, a man with dropsy was also present. Dropsy is a condition that we now call edema, where fluid builds up in parts of the body and causes swelling. We are not told why he was there, but his presence at the table led to another disagreement about Sabbath. After all, the Pharisees had believed that healing on the Sabbath amounted to doing work, and therefore it broke the law. And so all eyes were on Jesus to see what he would do. They were waiting for him to fall into the trap by breaking the law. In order for us to know whether Jesus was really breaking the Sabbath or not, breaking the law or not, we must understand the context for the Sabbath. So let's go back to the Old Testament for this. The Sabbath was given by God as one of the 10 commandments to the Israelites through Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 13 to 15, it was a day to remind them of how God had rescued them from their slave days in Egypt, liberating them into freedom. It was a holy day that was set apart for God's people to rest and be restored in him. In Mark chapter 2, verse 27, when Jesus was challenged by the Pharisees for what they saw as Sabbath breaking, for plucking the heads of grain, he replied, "The Sabbath was made for men, not men for Sabbath." In other words, the Sabbath was given as a blessing to men, not a burden for men. But over time, religious leaders had added layers upon layers of detailed rules and regulations around the Sabbath keeping that were well beyond what God had intended. These man-made regulations had overshadowed the heart of the Sabbath, turning it into a system of burdensome observance rather than restorative practice. The Sabbath was always about releasing people from their burdens. In fact, in Luke chapter 11, verse 46, Jesus confronts the religious leaders directly on this issue, saying, "Woe to you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." Healing the man with dropsy is an act of mercy that not only cures him, but frees him from the social and emotional brokenness that his condition brings. So Jesus was not violating the Sabbath, but fulfilling it. So when Jesus asked the question in verse 3, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? He was not actually asking a legal question, but his intent here was to expose the condition of their hearts. Because if the Pharisees had answered no, then they would appear inhumane and indifferent to suffering. But if they were to say yes, then they would be affirming the very action that they hoped to condemn. They tried to trap Jesus, but now they were caught in their own trap. So to drive the point home, Jesus followed up with the second question in verse 5. Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? But verse 6 tells us that the lawyers and the Pharisees could not reply to these things. What they had been teaching about the Sabbath was unnecessarily burdensome, and they themselves could not be consistent in applying it. His question had exposed their hypocrisy, and they were willing to show mercy when it served their own interests, yet refused to do the same for someone suffering right in front of them. What Jesus exposes here is also a warning for us. Like the Pharisees, the way that we are a church to each other can also miss the point and end up burdening people rather than blessing them. We sometimes unknowingly expect people to meet certain prerequisites before we welcome them, to verbalize their faith, to behave in familiar ways, to fit the mold of what we expect of a disciple. But Jesus placed no such expectations on the people that he welcomed. In the parable of the great banquet, in the later section of Luke 14, the master invited everyone, those in the city, to the outcasts of the city, to those outside of the city. In naming these groups of people, Jesus was not ranking them or reducing them to objects of charity. He was revealing that the love of God has no bounds. The Pharisees were so focused on their rules that they could not see the man who needed help. And our churches can fall into the same trap, not out of malice, but because we stop asking whether our ways of doing things are actually serving the people who are among us. If we are serious about the gospel, if we are serious about the Great Commission, about making disciples of all peoples, then we must go beyond simply serving the majority. We must examine our norms, question our assumptions, because what works for most does not always work for all, and the gospel is for all. Let me give an example. Many of us who have been Christians for long enough would be familiar with our practice of singing songs to worship God. My friend, though, is dyslexic, and she did not know that she had dyslexia until she was 10 years old. So growing up in Sunday school, she could not follow the lyrics like the other children because she couldn't read. While everyone sang, she would hum along instead. And unfortunately, this was not well received by her teachers, who interpreted her humming as defiance because they thought that she did not want to sing. So you can imagine how this experience of being scolded for humming made her feel more disabled than enabled. Singing praises to God through songs is a practice that most of us would never have thought twice about, because for most of us, it works. But for my friend, it didn't. The practice itself wasn't wrong. But what would have been wrong is knowing that she was struggling and doing nothing about it. Well, when we become aware that our ways of doing things are leaving someone out and we choose to carry on regardless, then it is our attitude that has created an obstacle for the person to come to God, to come to know God. And that is exactly what we see in Luke 14. The Pharisees saw the man with dropsy suffering right in front of them, and they chose their rules over his relief. Today I have titled this message, Are We a Blessing or a Burden? On one hand, the we could refer to people with disabilities, as if they are the ones that we are evaluating whether they are a blessing or a burden to us. But on the other hand, and this is the point of my message, the we I'm referring to is the church. Because the church was always meant to be a blessing, not a burden, a restorer, not a rule keeper. God's commands were always given for our good. They were always in service of a relationship between us and God and us and one another. So let's reflect on this question today. Are we, the church, being a burden or a blessing to people with special needs? The cost of sticking to our ways of doing things, of preserving the status quo, is too high. It leads to children with autism being asked to leave a service for being too disruptive. It causes youth with disabilities to quietly disappear from church because they don't feel like they fit in. Once a caregiver himself honestly shared with me his feelings about being part of a church. He said, "It's really okay if you don't help me to carry my cross, but please don't make it heavier." Don't make it heavier by praying for their healing when they didn't ask for it, and so imply that they need to be healed, cured, in order to be whole. Don't place expectations on parents to start a ministry for people like their children when they don't have the energy to take care of themselves. So how can we be a church that blesses people with special needs instead of being a burden? As I share a framework for disability inclusion, which we call the ABCs of inclusion, I will also share how I've seen it lived out. Because sometimes the word inclusion can seem so big and vague and therefore be overwhelming. Through our ministry to churches in Kin, we realize that many have the misconception that inclusion is a ministry that you do or a program that you run. Common questions that are asked of us are, how much budget does it take? How many volunteers do we need? What's a good ratio of volunteers to people with special needs? What would be the ideal ratio for that? But when we really think about it, real inclusion cannot just be a checklist of things to fulfill, but it is a culture that is built and lived out through relationships. Culture starts from us, and it starts with us taking small, doable steps. So with these ABCs, I hope to help us envision what a church that blesses and not burdens would look like. First, a church like that actively seeks to improve accessibility for people of all abilities. This could mean physical accessibility, such as installing lifts or ramps, or rearranging the furniture to allow wheelchair users to move around more freely. It could also mean communication accessibility, like learning sign language or using picture cards to communicate with those with limited speech, like these cards here that we developed, Sunday school communication cards that we developed last year. But accessibility goes beyond the physical. It could also be about the accessibility of our programs, for example, our cell groups. If every session is designed around intensive Bible study, reading, discussion, written reflection, who do you think might find difficult to be a part of this group? Someone with dyslexia? Someone with an intellectual disability? Someone with ADHD who struggles to sit through a text-heavy discussion. So the format itself, however well-intentioned, can accidentally shut people out. So we should then ask, are our small groups designed only for those who learn in one particular way? Or can we reimagine them so that everyone has a genuine way to experience fellowship? And this is something that Kertia, the man on the left of this picture, has started to do with some young adults who are neurodivergent. And it began from a resource that Kin developed called Koinonia Groups. Koinonia Groups is a practical guide for churches that want to reimagine what inclusive small groups could look like. We have brought this book today at our booth that will be outside in the canteen later, so you can check it out later if you want to. So two members of this community, Kertia and one of the group's core members, will be facilitating a conversation over lunch later after the second service on what it looks like to include people with special needs in small groups. And I've been very encouraged to see how this group has journeyed with one another over the past year. So the first way that a church can be a blessing is when it is willing to carry the burden of change so that others do not have to carry the burden of exclusion. And the second way a church can be a blessing is to step outside of its comfort zone to cultivate belonging. Most churches have a discipleship model that works well for the majority. But when someone with different needs enters the picture, that model is often challenged. A disability-inclusive church doesn't cling rigidly to its familiar ways. It redefines it together with the person so that everyone has a place to grow in community. This man that you see on the screen, his name is Mitchell, and Mitchell has autism. For many years, he was left out of children's ministry, youth ministry, and most of church life. Though he was physically present, he had no friends and no community in the church. Things began to change when one young man in his church decided to simply make friends with him, sharing meals, conversations, and gradually inviting others to join. And this circle grew, and in the process, they didn't just include Mitchell in social activities. They took time to truly understand him as a person and learned to redefine what friendship looks like. Friendship with someone with autism may not look like the friendships that we are used to, but it's not lesser. It's just different. And the same is true for discipleship. Today, Mitchell is fully involved in his youth ministry. Last year, for the first time in his 29 years, he invited friends over to his home. He knows now that he belongs, and he knows that he is missed when he is not there. But inclusion doesn't stop at belonging, because to truly belong is also to contribute. The third way that a church can be a blessing is to intentionally identify the gifts of every individual and create space for them to contribute, even if it challenges the way that things have always been done. So at Kin, we experienced this during one of our community of practice sessions. These sessions serve the church by exploring disability-related topics. But more than simply raising awareness, we have been striving to go further, to create space for people with disabilities to serve alongside us, not just to be spoken about. So for this particular session last year, we invited one of our friends, Miss Lo Janmei, to be our MC. So I'd like to show you this video of how she did the MCing.
Interpreted services to now having deaf-led missional self of signing babies. I'm particularly proud of our work in making church services and church life more accessible through interpretation and live captioning for our deaf and hard of hearing members.
As you may have noticed, Janmei is deaf and she communicates through sign language. During the event, we had someone in the front row interpreting her signing for the audience. And when she took the stage to host, I realized that the entire hall fell into pin-drop silence as she shared her testimony through sign language. That day I learned that by simply flipping the script, by translating what she was saying to the hearing audience, instead of the usual setup where things were translated for her, people who did not speak her language were able to witness her gift of hosting and storytelling. Her presence and gifts were honored, and she richly blessed us with a broadened perspective just by serving with us. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 12 that we are one body made up of many parts, and that the parts that seem weaker are indispensable. This should tell us to stop seeing people as ministry recipients and begin recognizing them as ministry partners. We gather not because we share the same profiles, interests, or abilities, but because of Christ. Each of us has a unique part to play, and we need one another to fulfill it. People with disabilities are not just a good to have in our church. When we fully welcome and disciple people of all abilities, the whole body is more fully what God intended the church to be. A church that blesses and not burdens is one that is intentional about its ABCs, making access possible, cultivating belonging, and encouraging meaningful contribution. This is what it means to be a family that welcomes people with disabilities. It is a church where people with and without disabilities enable one another to flourish as disciples and disciple makers. And that's exactly what Jesus modeled for us in Luke chapter 14. When presented with a dilemma, he was clear about what was more important. Bringing restoration to the person in front of him was more important than following the rules. The work of the gospel starts here with the people who are right in front of us, who are among us. Not to be tolerated, not accommodated, but welcomed fully into the heart of this church family. And I pray that yours will be a church that truly reflects the heart of Jesus and truly reaches out to every person, leaving no one behind. Let us close in prayer. Father, forgive us for the times that our expectations and rules have spoken louder than your love. Forgive us for the times that We have made your love seem smaller than it really is. Give us the courage to carry the burden of change so that those who are minority would not be excluded, but brought into your family. You have shown us how to love by adopting us. Let us now do it to one another so that every person who walks through these doors find that they truly belong here. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.